If you sign that document, your company won't survive the week. The words cut through the boardroom so sharply that even the air seemed to stop moving. 23 floors above Manhattan, inside the glass conference suite of Callaway Global, every executive turned at once. The city lights shimmered against the rain outside, blurring into silver streaks across the windows, but inside the room, nobody blinked. Naomi Brooks stood near the far wall beside the coffee station, one hand wrapped around a black tablet, the other trembling just enough for her to hide it behind a folder. For a second, no one even processed that the voice had come from her. Naomi was invisible here. She was the quiet black assistant who refilled water glasses, printed reports, and stayed silent while powerful people decided the future of companies worth billions. Richard Callaway slowly lowered the silver pen in his hand. His gray suit looked almost metallic beneath the recessed ceiling lights, perfectly tailored, perfectly controlled, just like the man himself. "Excuse me," he asked quietly. The room stayed frozen. Naomi swallowed hard. She could feel every eye landing on her at once now, heavy and cold. "The compliance report was altered," she said carefully. "If you approve the merger tonight, federal investigators will trace the fraud directly back to this board." A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. One man near the center of the table let out a short laugh under his breath. Another leaned back in his leather chair like he couldn't believe an assistant had just interrupted a 9-figure emergency meeting. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Who allowed you to speak?" he asked. Naomi felt heat crawl up her neck, but she didn't look away. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the silence between them. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across the city. "No one, sir," she answered. "But somebody needed to." Across the table, Martin Keller, the company's chief legal officer, gave a sharp smile that never reached his eyes. "This is exactly why assistants should stay in their lane," he said calmly. A few people chuckled nervously. Naomi's fingers tightened around the tablet. She had spent 11 months inside this building being ignored so thoroughly that people spoke about her while she stood 3 feet away. They forgot she was there because that was easier than seeing her. Easier than noticing the quiet black woman carrying coffee into rooms where nobody expected intelligence to enter unless it wore a $6,000 suit. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. "You're interrupting a federal-level acquisition," he said. "Do you understand the consequences of making accusations like this?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." Her voice stayed calm, but her heartbeat slammed against her ribs so hard it almost hurt. "That's why I checked the numbers 3 times before I walked in here." Martin laughed louder this time. "Check the numbers?" he repeated. "With what qualifications exactly?" Naomi hesitated, just for half a second, and in that half second, the room had already decided who she was. An assistant, a distraction, a mistake. But then Naomi lifted the tablet slightly, and the reflection of encrypted transaction files flashed across the dark screen. "The kind that can prove someone inside this room has been moving money through offshore accounts for the last 18 months, she said softly. This time nobody laughed. The silence inside the boardroom changed shape after that. It was no longer the polished silence of wealthy executives controlling a crisis. It was heavier now, unstable, like the moment before a glass ceiling finally cracks. Martin Keller's smile faded first, just slightly, but Naomi saw it. She noticed the small twitch near his jaw, the quick flick of his eyes toward the laptop sitting open beside him. Richard Callaway noticed it too. The rain hammered harder against the windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, washing the city lights into streaks of gold and white across the glass walls. Nobody reached for their water anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Naomi stood alone near the far end of the conference room, her charcoal gray assistant badge hanging against her navy blouse, looking painfully out of place among $10,000 watches and tailored European suits. Yet somehow, she was the only person in the room who looked steady. Richard slowly folded his hands together on the table. "Show me," he said. Martin leaned forward immediately. "Richard, this is ridiculous. She is an assistant pulling numbers off spreadsheets she does not understand." Naomi did not react to him this time. Her eyes stayed on Richard. "The shell companies began appearing 18 months ago," she said quietly. "Small transfers at first, under reporting thresholds. Then larger movement through overseas vendors connected to internal legal approvals." Martin scoffed. "This is unbelievable." Naomi tapped her tablet once. Transaction records appeared on the large presentation screen at the front of the room. Dates, account numbers, approval signatures. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as the glowing columns reflected across the polished black conference table. One older investor adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. Another executive stopped typing altogether. Richard's expression hardened as he stared at the screen. These approvals came from legal, Naomi continued. But the authorization timestamps do not match the company's server logs. Martin's voice sharpened instantly. Enough. He stood so quickly his chair rolled backwards several inches across the marble floor. You have absolutely no authority to access these files. Naomi finally looked at him directly. I know. Her voice remained soft. That is why I almost walked away. The room fell still again. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Naomi swallowed before continuing. 3 weeks ago, I was organizing archived merger reports downstairs. I found duplicate approval records that should not have existed. At first, I thought it was a system error. She paused briefly, remembering the endless nights alone in the records department while cleaning crews vacuumed empty hallways around her. But then I noticed every altered document passed through the same office. Martin gave a cold laugh that sounded more forced now. You expect this board to believe you uncovered a federal conspiracy while filing paperwork. Naomi lowered the tablet slowly. No, she said. I expect them to believe the evidence. Richard stood from his chair at last. The movement alone changed the entire room. Men who controlled hedge funds and billion-dollar portfolios suddenly looked nervous. Richard walked toward the presentation screen without speaking. His reflection moved beside the transaction records glowing across the glass. Naomi could hear her own heartbeat again now, loud and uneven beneath the hum of recessed ceiling lights. Martin stepped forward carefully. Richard, she is manipulating incomplete data. We are hours away from finalizing the acquisition. Do not let panic destroy this company. Richard did not answer immediately. He stared at one transaction line for several long seconds. Then his voice came low and controlled. Why? He asked slowly. Does this authorization contain my digital signature on a date I was in Switzerland? Nobody moved. Naomi felt the temperature in the room drop all at once. Martin's face lost color. And somewhere far below the tower, faint but unmistakable, came the distant sound of sirens growing closer. The sirens grew louder beneath the building, echoing faintly through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan like a warning nobody inside the boardroom could ignore anymore. Richard Calloway remained standing near the presentation screen, staring at the forged authorization record with an expression Naomi could not read completely. But she saw enough. For the first time since she started working at Calloway Global, the most powerful man in the company did not look untouchable. He looked blindsided. Martin Keller recovered first. He straightened his tie carefully, forcing calm back into his posture like a man trying to hold together cracking glass. Richard, he said evenly, this is exactly what panic does. You are allowing a temporary employee to create chaos based on incomplete files she accessed illegally. Naomi stayed still near the wall, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to walk out while she still could. Her throat felt dry now. The boardroom suddenly seemed smaller than before, tighter somehow, the ceiling lower, the air heavier. One of the executives near the far side of the table cleared his throat nervously. Another quietly closed his laptop. Nobody wanted to be associated with the wrong side of this conversation anymore. Richard finally turned around. Illegally, he repeated quietly. Martin nodded immediately. Absolutely. She violated internal security protocols. Whatever she found is inadmissible and likely misunderstood. Naomi could feel several eyes drifting toward her again, searching her face for hesitation, fear, weakness, anything they could use to dismiss her. She had seen those looks her whole life. Teachers who assumed she copied test scores because a quiet black girl from Baltimore was not supposed to outperform entire classrooms. Hiring managers who praised her intelligence before asking whether she would be comfortable in high-pressure environments. Executives inside this very building who called her sweetheart instead of learning her name. Richard walked slowly back toward the table. The soft leather soles of his shoes barely made a sound against the marble floor. You said the shell companies connect back to legal, he said. Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. Martin laughed again, but now the sound carried strain beneath it. This is absurd. Naomi inhaled slowly before speaking. 3 vendor accounts received internal transfers through offshore subsidiaries registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Every authorization passed through your office. Martin's expression darkened instantly. Be very careful what you accuse me of. Naomi looked at him directly now. Her voice remained calm, but something stronger had entered it. I already was careful. The room fell silent again. Rain slid slowly down the enormous windows behind Richard, blurring the skyline into ghostly silver shapes. Somewhere below them, another siren joined the first. Closer now. Richard looked toward the presentation screen once more. Pull up the timestamps, he ordered quietly. Naomi hesitated for half a second. Martin noticed immediately. Richard, enough. Shut this down before you destroy investor confidence over conspiracy theories. Richard's eyes hardened. The timestamps, Naomi. Her fingers moved across the tablet screen. A new set of records appeared instantly. Login histories. Approval chains. Geographic access points. Several executives leaned forward at once now, no longer pretending disinterest. One older board member adjusted his glasses and whispered something under his breath. Richard stared at the screen for several long seconds before speaking again. These approvals originated from inside the building while I was overseas. Yes, sir, Naomi answered softly. Martin stepped forward sharply. Digital signatures can be cloned. This proves nothing. Naomi swallowed hard. There is more. Martin's head snapped toward her. Naomi opened another encrypted folder slowly. The overhead lights reflected across the black conference table as hidden email chains filled the screen one by one. Secret payments. Internal warnings. Legal directives marked confidential. And at the center of every conversation was Martin Keller's name. Nobody spoke now. Not even Martin. Then Richard lowered himself slowly into his chair, eyes fixed on the glowing screen, and for the first time all night, the billionaire looked genuinely afraid. For several long seconds, nobody inside the boardroom moved at all. The glowing email chains stretched across the massive presentation screen like cracks running through glass, impossible to ignore once seen. Martin Keller remained standing near the center of the room, but the confidence he wore so effortlessly earlier had started slipping away piece by piece. A thin layer of sweat now reflected beneath the recessed lights along his forehead. Richard Calloway sat motionless at the head of the table, elbows resting against the black marble surface, his eyes fixed on the screen without blinking. Naomi could hear the low hum of Manhattan traffic far below the tower, mixed with the distant sirens still climbing closer through the storm. One of the investors quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his face. Another board member shifted his chair backwards several inches, as if physical distance might somehow separate him from what he was seeing. Naomi stayed near the far wall beside the untouched coffee service, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands no longer trembled now. Fear had burned through her already. What remained felt colder than fear. It felt final. Martin finally spoke again, but this time his voice lacked the polished certainty that usually controlled every room he entered. These emails prove nothing, he said sharply. Anyone with enough access could fabricate records. Naomi looked toward him carefully. I thought the same thing at first. Martin's jaw tightened. You are way out of your depth. Richard raised one hand slowly, silencing him without looking up. That small gesture changed the atmosphere instantly. Martin stopped talking mid-sentence. Nobody interrupted Richard Calloway when he used that tone. Richard stared at another email chain glowing across the screen. These messages mention internal audit suppression, he said quietly. Why would legal suppress an audit? Martin stepped forward immediately. Because the acquisition was time-sensitive. We were avoiding unnecessary delays. Naomi swallowed once before speaking. Then why were the deleted records rerouted through offshore vendor accounts? The room fell silent again. Richard finally looked up at Martin directly. Answer her. Martin opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately this time. Naomi noticed it again, that tiny flicker of panic hidden behind expensive confidence. She had seen men like him her whole life too. Men who mistook power for permanence. Men who believed assistants, cleaners, receptionists, and quiet black women were invisible because they never bothered looking down long enough to realize who was listening. Outside the windows, lightning flashed silently above the skyline, turning the entire boardroom silver for half a second before darkness settled back in. Richard stood once more, slower this time. He walked toward the screen again, studying the records line by line while the executives watched him nervously. How long have you known? He asked without turning around. Naomi hesitated briefly. 21 days. Several people looked at her in disbelief. Richard finally turned halfway toward her. And you waited until tonight? Naomi lowered her eyes for the first time all evening. I tried reporting it internally. Martin's face hardened instantly. That is a lie. Naomi ignored him. 3 requests disappeared. 2 meetings were canceled. Then my building access was restricted last Friday. One older board member frowned deeply. Restricted by who? Naomi looked directly at Martin now. Nobody in the room missed it. Richard's expression darkened. Martin gave a cold laugh, but it sounded hollow now. This is becoming absurd. Then suddenly the conference room doors opened. Every head turned at once. 2 uniformed federal agents stepped inside beside the company's head of security, rainwater still glistening across their dark coats from outside. The taller agent scanned the room once before speaking calmly. Richard Calloway? The billionaire remained standing near the presentation screen. Yes. The agent removed a sealed folder slowly. Sir, we need to ask several questions regarding an ongoing financial investigation connected to Calloway Global. Nobody breathed. Naomi felt her stomach tighten as the entire room shifted toward Richard at once. But before the agent could continue, Richard lifted one hand toward Naomi without taking his eyes off the federal badge. Do not let her leave this building. And for the first time all night, nobody looked at Naomi Brooks like she was invisible anymore. The moment the federal agents stepped fully into the boardroom, the entire atmosphere inside Calloway Global changed from corporate tension to quiet panic. Nobody touched the merger documents anymore. Nobody checked stock projections or legal notes. The billion-dollar acquisition sitting open across the conference table suddenly looked meaningless beside the sealed federal folder resting in the taller agent's hand. Rain continued sliding down the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan, but inside the room the silence felt almost airless. Richard Calloway remained standing near the presentation screen, shoulders rigid, eyes colder now than Naomi had ever seen them. What exactly is this regarding? He asked carefully. The taller agent glanced briefly toward the glowing financial records still displayed across the monitors. Financial fraud, offshore laundering activity, and obstruction of federal review. Several executives visibly stiffened. One investor quietly removed his company badge and slid it into his pocket like he no longer wanted his name connected to the building. Naomi stayed near the back wall beside the untouched coffee trays, suddenly aware that everyone in the room kept glancing at her now. Not with dismissal anymore. With calculation. With fear. Martin Keller forced a smile onto his face and stepped forward smoothly. Agents, there has clearly been some misunderstanding caused by incomplete internal data. Naomi noticed the taller federal agent barely looked at him. Mr. Keller, the man said evenly, we know exactly who you are. The color drained slightly from Martin's face again. Richard turned slowly toward him. You knew about this investigation? Martin answered too quickly. Of course not. Naomi felt something tighten deep in her stomach. The room no longer felt like a boardroom now. It felt like the exact second before a skyscraper loses power during a storm. Quiet. Suspended. Waiting for impact. One of the younger executives finally spoke up nervously. Richard, maybe we should postpone the acquisition until this is resolved. Richard did not answer him immediately. His attention remained fixed on Martin. 21 days, he said quietly. She found this 21 days ago. Martin's voice sharpened instantly. You are seriously trusting an assistant over your own legal department? Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Assistant. The word sounded different now than it had earlier that night. Before, it had meant invisible, small, disposable. But now every person in the room understood something they had missed for almost a year. Naomi Brooks had walked into the boardroom carrying the truth, while all of them carried titles. Richard finally looked toward her again. Why did you stay? He asked quietly. Naomi hesitated. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished marble floor beneath her feet. Because innocent employees would lose everything if this company collapsed, she answered. People in payroll, custodial staff, administrative teams. They would pay for decisions they never made. Nobody spoke after that. The words settled heavily across the room. Martin suddenly laughed once, but there was no confidence left in it now. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "We are standing here listening to moral speeches from somebody who files expense reports." Naomi looked at him calmly. "And yet I was still the first person who noticed your numbers did not add up." A silence followed so sharp it almost hurt. One of the federal agents exchanged a quick glance with the other. Richard slowly walked back toward the head of the conference table. The city lights outside shimmered faintly through the storm behind him, turning his reflection into something tired and unfamiliar across the dark glass. Then he stopped beside Martin. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice came low and controlled. "You built this entire company on the assumption that quiet people are powerless." Martin swallowed hard. Richard looked toward Naomi one last time before speaking again. "You almost got away with it," he said quietly to Martin, "because nobody here thought she mattered." The boardroom slowly emptied after that, but the silence stayed behind like smoke after a fire. Executives left without speaking much, their polished shoes clicking softly across the marble floor before disappearing into the dim hallway outside. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody defended Martin Keller now that federal agents had begun quietly collecting devices and reviewing internal files. The storm outside Manhattan had weakened to a cold drizzle, and pale midnight light reflected across the massive glass walls surrounding the conference room. Naomi remained near the back of the room alone, arms folded tightly against herself, watching the city blur beneath sheets of rain nearly 24 stories below. Her body finally felt tired now. Not the ordinary tired she carried after 12-hour workdays and subway rides home. This exhaustion sat deeper than that. Heavy, emotional, like something inside her had been holding its breath for months and had only now started breathing again. She heard footsteps behind her, but did not turn immediately. Richard Calloway stopped several feet away near the head of the empty conference table. Without the board members surrounding him, he somehow looked older. The sharp certainty that usually defined his face had softened into something quieter tonight. He loosened his tie slightly, staring down at the dark marble table where the unsigned merger documents still sat untouched beneath the overhead lights. "Everyone else left," he said finally. Naomi nodded once. "I know." Another silence settled between them, softer this time. The giant room no longer felt dangerous now that the shouting and accusations were gone. Only the low hum of ventilation remained, mixing with distant thunder fading farther across the city. Richard rested one hand against the back of a chair slowly. "You said you reported this internally." Naomi looked down briefly. 3 times. And nobody listened. It was not a question. Naomi gave a small shake of her head. Richard exhaled quietly through his nose. "I built an entire company around efficiency," he said after a moment. "Performance. Precision. Results." He paused, staring toward the rain-streaked windows. "And somehow I still created a place where the smartest person in the room was treated like she did not exist." Naomi swallowed, but said nothing. Richard looked toward her carefully now. "Why did you become an assistant?" The question caught her off guard. Most executives never asked anything personal unless it appeared on payroll forms. Naomi hesitated before answering. "I used to work in forensic analytics in Baltimore," she said quietly. "Then my mother got sick." Richard listened without interrupting. "Cancer treatments were expensive. I left my old job to take care of her." Her voice remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around her sleeves. "After she passed, nobody wanted to hire someone with a 2-year employment gap." Richard's eyes lowered briefly. Naomi continued staring toward the windows instead of him. "Eventually, I stopped correcting people when they assumed I was only qualified to organize calendars." The room fell quiet again. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass behind them like silver threads beneath the city lights. Richard leaned against the edge of the table carefully, studying her. Now with an expression Naomi could not fully recognize. Not pity. Something else. Regret, maybe. "You saved this company tonight," he said softly. Naomi shook her head almost immediately. "No, sir." Richard frowned slightly. "No." Naomi finally looked at him directly. "I tried to save the people inside it." That answer seemed to hit him harder than everything else that had happened all evening. Richard looked away toward the dark skyline again, jaw tightening slightly. For the first time in years, he appeared like a man seeing his own reflection clearly and not liking what stared back. Then after a long silence, he spoke again, quieter than before. "I owe you an apology." Naomi blinked once, surprised. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the rain outside. Not just for tonight, he said. For every time this building taught you to stay quiet because nobody important was listening. By 2:15 in the morning, most of the lights inside Callaway Global had gone dark. Entire departments sat empty beyond the glass walls outside the boardroom. Rows of abandoned desks glowing faintly beneath emergency lighting while rain continued drifting across Manhattan in soft silver waves. Naomi stood alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows now, arms loosely folded, staring down at the wet streets nearly 300 feet below. Police vehicles and black federal sedans lined the curb outside the tower entrance like scattered shadows beneath flashing lights. Somewhere deeper inside the building, muted voices echoed through hallways as investigators moved floor by floor collecting records. The company that once felt untouchable suddenly sounded fragile. Human. Behind her, Richard Callaway remained seated at the head of the long conference table, silent for so long Naomi almost forgot he was still there. His jacket rested over the back of a chair now, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, exhaustion softening the sharpness that usually defined him. Several untouched cups of cold coffee sat scattered across the table beside stacks of legal files and glowing tablet screens. The merger was dead. Everyone in the city would know by sunrise. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, letting the quiet settle around her. She should have felt victorious after everything that happened tonight. Instead, she mostly felt empty. The kind of emptiness that comes after carrying fear for too long. Richard finally broke the silence. Martin confessed. Naomi turned slowly. Richard rubbed one hand across his jaw before continuing. Not everything, but enough. The overhead lights reflected faintly in his tired eyes. The offshore accounts. The audit suppression. The forged approvals. Naomi said nothing. Richard looked down at the dark marble table for a moment before speaking again. He assumed I would sign the merger tonight without reviewing the details closely. A bitter smile touched the corner of his mouth briefly. And honestly, he was probably right. Naomi studied him quietly. The billionaire who once controlled every room he entered now looked like a man sorting through the ruins of his own certainty. Richard exhaled slowly. Federal investigators confirmed the signatures were cloned through internal access years ago. He looked toward Naomi again. You were the only person who caught it. Naomi lowered her eyes. I was the only person looking. The words hung softly between them. Richard leaned back in his chair carefully. Do you know what the worst part is? Naomi did not answer. Richard stared toward the rain sliding down the windows. I built this company telling myself I valued intelligence above everything else. His voice stayed calm, but quieter now. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people clearly. Naomi listened without interrupting. Richard gave a faint shake of his head. I listened to whoever sounded confident, whoever looked powerful, whoever already belonged in rooms like this. His eyes drifted toward her assistant badge resting against her blouse. And I overlooked the person who actually protected this company, because she did not fit the image I expected. Naomi felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She looked back out toward the city lights again. Most people do, she admitted softly. Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable this time. Just honest. Then Richard stood slowly from his chair and walked toward her across the quiet boardroom. His reflection moved beside hers across the rain-covered glass. You said something earlier, he said carefully, about innocent people paying for powerful people's pride. Naomi nodded once. Richard looked down toward the streets below. You were right. The admission came quietly, but Naomi understood how much it cost him to say it aloud. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. Human Resources drafted termination paperwork for you 3 hours ago, he said. Naomi blinked once in surprise. Richard looked at the paper briefly before tearing it cleanly in half. The sound seemed unusually loud in the empty boardroom. Then he handed her another folder instead. Naomi frowned slightly. What is this? Richard's expression softened just enough to feel real. A formal offer. Naomi stared at him cautiously. Richard gave a small nod toward the folder in her hands. Director of Corporate Intelligence. Naomi looked down at the title slowly, unable to speak for several seconds. Then Richard said the one thing nobody in that building had ever told her before. You should have been sitting at this table a long time ago. Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan, pale gray sunlight spreading across wet streets and glass towers still shining from the storm that had passed overnight. Inside Callaway Global, the atmosphere felt unfamiliar. Quieter. Slower. News alerts flashed across televisions in lobby waiting areas while employees whispered in elevators and hallways, pretending not to stare every time federal investigators crossed the building carrying sealed document boxes. The failed merger dominated every financial network by sunrise. But inside the company, another story moved even faster. People had started talking about Naomi Brooks, the assistant nobody noticed, the woman who uncovered the fraud, the woman who stopped the company from collapsing. Naomi stepped out of the elevator on the executive floor just after 8:05 that morning, holding a simple black folder against her chest. Her navy coat was still damp near the sleeves from the cold drizzle outside, and her dark curls framed a face that looked calmer than she felt. The moment the elevator doors opened, conversations nearby stopped almost instantly. Analysts standing near the reception desk lowered their voices. Two executives who once walked past her without a glance suddenly stepped aside to let her pass. Naomi noticed all of it, though she kept walking quietly down the long hallway lined with glass offices and silver company logos. The building smelled faintly of fresh coffee, printer toner, and rain carried in from outside. Familiar smells. Yet everything felt different now. Halfway down the corridor, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Naomi. She turned slowly. Richard Callaway approached carrying no entourage, no assistants, no legal staff trailing behind him. Just a dark overcoat folded over one arm and visible exhaustion beneath his eyes. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Employees nearby pretended to work while quietly watching from behind computer screens and partially opened office doors. Richard glanced briefly around the hallway before looking back at her. "The board approved your appointment unanimously this morning," he said. Naomi blinked once. That was fast. Richard gave a faint smile. People move quickly when they realize who has been saving them. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly at that. The hallway fell quiet again. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished floors beneath them. Richard shifted the folder beneath his arm before speaking again, quieter this time. "I also reviewed your old employment records last night." Naomi looked up, surprised. "Your forensic analysis reports from Baltimore were exceptional." His voice carried genuine respect now. "You should have been leading teams years ago." Naomi let out the smallest breath of disbelief. That is not exactly how hiring managers saw it. Richard's expression tightened slightly because he understood what she meant without needing it explained. A black woman with a resume gap became invisible to people who only recognized talent when it looked familiar to them. Richard nodded once. "I know." The honesty in that answer caught Naomi off guard more than the promotion had. Richard looked down the long, executive hallway around them, glass offices glowing beneath the morning light. "This building failed you," he admitted quietly. "Not just me. All of us." Naomi studied him carefully. Billionaires rarely apologized without protecting themselves first. But Richard looked different now. Less polished, less certain, more human than she had ever seen him. "Most companies do not know how to listen to quiet people," Naomi said softly. Richard nodded slowly. "Then maybe it is time this one learns." Another silence settled between them, but this one felt lighter somehow. The kind of silence that follows truth instead of fear. Then Richard reached into his coat pocket and handed her a new security badge. Naomi looked down at it carefully. The word assistant was gone. Beneath her name, now read Director of Corporate Intelligence. Naomi stared at the badge for several long seconds while soft morning light reflected across the silver lettering. Around them, employees continued pretending not to watch. But nobody missed what happened next. Richard Callaway stepped slightly aside in the hallway and quietly said 4 words nobody in that building had ever said to Naomi Brooks before. "After you, Ms. Brooks." 3 weeks later, the storm that nearly destroyed Callaway Global had become the story every financial network in America could not stop talking about. Federal investigations continued quietly behind closed doors, shareholders demanded reforms, and Martin Keller's name disappeared from the company website like he had never existed there at all. But inside the tower overlooking Manhattan, something deeper had changed. People listened differently now. The executive floor no longer felt untouchable and cold in the same way it once had. Conversations softened when assistants entered rooms. Receptionists were greeted by name. Junior analysts who used to sit silent in meetings suddenly found executives asking for their opinions. Small changes, quiet changes, but real ones. Naomi Brooks noticed them every day. On a gray Thursday morning, sunlight filtered softly through the massive windows lining the executive hallway as Naomi walked toward the boardroom carrying a thin black portfolio against her side. Her new security badge rested neatly against a charcoal blazer, the silver title beneath her name catching light each time she passed the glass offices along the corridor. Employees looked up as she walked by now, but not with surprise anymore. With respect. Some nodded politely. Others stepped aside without thinking. Nobody called her sweetheart. Nobody mistook her for catering staff anymore. The boardroom doors opened automatically as she approached. Inside, several executives were already seated around the long marble table reviewing quarterly compliance reports. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Richard Calloway stood near the windows overlooking the city skyline, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms again, speaking quietly with two board members. When he noticed Naomi enter, he stopped mid-conversation immediately. Every person at the table turned toward her at once. But this time, nobody looked uncomfortable. Nobody looked dismissive. Richard gave a small nod toward the empty chair beside him at the head of the table. Her chair. Naomi paused for the briefest second before crossing the room. The soft sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed gently beneath the recessed lights overhead. 3 weeks ago, she stood near the back wall holding coffee trays while powerful people talked over her like she was invisible. Now those same people waited quietly for her to sit before opening the meeting. Naomi placed her portfolio on the table carefully and took her seat. Outside the windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath pale morning light,